The complex appeared on no official maps, existed in no military records available to the public, and was referred to only by bland bureaucratic designation that disguised its true purpose: Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But the local Chinese population in Harbin, Manchuria, knew it by a different name, the place where people went and never returned, where screams could sometimes be heard despite the thick walls, where smoke from the crematoriums carried the smell of burning human flesh. Behind the compound's electrified fences and watchtowers, behind walls designed to contain secrets rather than just prisoners, Unit 731 conducted medical experiments so grotesque that even 79 years after its closure, the full details remain partially classified, too disturbing for complete public disclosure, too damning to the nations that knew about it and chose silence over justice. Between 1936 and 1945, at least 10,000 people, though realistic estimates suggest closer to 300,000 when including all satellite facilities, were subjected to experiments that redefined human cruelty in the name of military science. They were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid to study disease progression without treatment. They were subjected to vivisection, dissection while alive and conscious, so doctors could observe living organ function before death. They were frozen and thawed repeatedly to test frostbite treatments. They were locked in pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their skulls. They were spun in centrifuges until death. They were deprived of food and water to establish baseline survival times. They were injected with animal blood to test species compatibility. They were exposed to lethal doses of X-rays to document radiation effects. They were subjected to rape and forced pregnancy to study syphilis transmission and weapon-grade pathogens' effects on fetuses. And when the experiments were complete, when the subjects had provided all the data their tortured bodies could yield, they were killed, murdered to prevent testimony, cremated to destroy evidence, reduced to ashes and anonymous statistics in research papers that would later be used by American scientists who granted immunity to the perpetrators in exchange for their data. This is the story of Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's biological and chemical warfare research program that turned human beings into experimental animals, that conducted atrocities matching or exceeding Nazi death camp horrors, but which remains far less known in Western historical consciousness because the Allied powers, particularly the United States, chose to cover up the crimes in exchange for scientific data and strategic advantage against the Soviet Union. It's about the doctors who designed the experiments, educated physicians who'd taken oaths to do no harm but who rationalized torture as necessary military research. About the subjects they called logs, or monkeys, dehumanizing language that made it psychologically easier to dissect living prisoners and inject children with plague. About the Japanese government that funded and authorized the program, that deployed biological weapons developed through these experiments against Chinese civilians, that murdered entire villages to test weapon effectiveness. About the American occupation forces who discovered the program after Japan's surrender and faced a choice: prosecute the perpetrators for war crimes or grant them immunity in exchange for research data that US scientists wanted and didn't want the Soviets to obtain. And about the decision to choose data over justice, to protect war criminals because their knowledge was valuable, to hide the truth for decades because acknowledging it would reveal American complicity in covering up atrocities that rivaled Nuremberg's charges. The program's creator was Shiro Ishii, a brilliant microbiologist and army medical officer who'd become obsessed with biological warfare's potential after studying European chemical weapons development following World War I. Ishii recognized that Japan, resource-poor and industrially weaker than Western powers, needed asymmetric weapons that could offset conventional military disadvantages. Biological weapons were perfect, cheap to produce, capable of causing mass casualties, difficult to defend against, and psychologically terrifying. But developing effective biological weapons required human experimentation, testing pathogens and delivery systems on living subjects to understand infection rates, symptom progression, and lethality. This presented ethical obstacles that Ishii dismissed with reasoning that would become standard justification throughout Unit 731's operation. The subjects would be prisoners already condemned to death, criminals and political dissidents whose lives were forfeit anyway, enemy nationals whose suffering served Japan's imperial mission. Using them for experiments was merely extracting final value from lives that were already deemed worthless by the state. This logic, disturbingly similar to Nazi rationalization for concentration camp experiments, transformed medical research into systematic murder by redefining certain humans as non-human, as biological resources to be consumed in pursuit of scientific and military goals. The Harbin facility was constructed in 1936 in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, far from Japan proper where such activities might face domestic scrutiny. in territory where Japanese military authority was absolute and local Chinese population had no legal protections or recourse. The complex covered 6 square kilometers, included laboratories equipped with the most advanced scientific equipment available, prison blocks that could hold thousands of subjects simultaneously, production facilities capable of manufacturing tons of biological agents, and a dedicated crematorium that ran constantly, disposing of bodies at a rate that suggested industrial-scale killing rather than occasional experimental casualties. The staff numbered over 3,000, including microbiologists, physicians, engineers, and support personnel, all sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of death, all complicit in activities they understood were criminal but rationalized as necessary for Japan's survival and military superiority. The facility operated under military security protocols that made it essentially invisible. Locals who asked questions disappeared, foreign observers were kept away through aggressive perimeter security, and even other Japanese military units had limited knowledge of what Unit 731 actually did beyond vague references to disease research and epidemic prevention. The subjects came from multiple sources but were predominantly Chinese civilians, including women and children, arrested on fabricated charges or simply kidnapped from areas under Japanese occupation. They also included Soviet prisoners captured during border conflicts, Korean independence activists, European civilians who'd been in the wrong place when Japan needed experimental subjects, and even some Japanese citizens deemed politically unreliable or socially undesirable. Once imprisoned in Unit 731, subjects were stripped of names and referred to by numbers, processed through intake procedures that included medical examinations designed to establish baseline health before experimentation began. They were sorted by age, sex, and health status, creating cohorts for different experimental protocols, human beings reduced to variables in research designs that required large sample sizes to achieve statistical significance. The researchers maintained detailed records of each subject's background, physical condition, and experimental treatment, documentation that would later prove invaluable to American scientists who obtained these records and used them without crediting their horrific origins. The experiments themselves were designed to answer specific military and scientific questions with methodologies that would be completely unethical under any recognized medical standards but which Unit 731's doctors pursued with clinical detachment that suggested they'd successfully compartmentalized the humanity of their subjects. Plague research involved infecting subjects with Yersinia pestis via various routes, injection, ingestion, inhalation, to determine most effective delivery methods and document symptom progression from initial infection through death, which typically occurred within 5 to 7 days in excruciating suffering that researchers observed and recorded without providing pain relief or treatment. Frostbite experiments subjected prisoners to extreme cold, freezing limbs to various degrees, then testing different thawing methods to determine optimal treatment protocols for Japanese soldiers fighting in Manchuria's brutal winters. These experiments were conducted with particular cruelty. Subjects were taken outside in winter, had their arms or legs exposed and doused with water until frozen solid, then brought inside where researchers would test thawing techniques including immersion in water at various temperatures, exposure to heat lamps, or simple ambient warming, documenting which methods best preserved tissue viability while the subject experienced agonizing pain from nerve damage and tissue death. Vivisection, live dissection without anesthesia, was conducted routinely because researchers wanted to observe organ function in living bodies, claiming that anesthesia would alter physiological responses and contaminate results. Subjects were restrained on operating tables, their bodies opened surgically while they were conscious and aware, internal organs examined and documented while still functioning, researchers taking notes on heart function and lung capacity and digestive processes while the subject screamed or had their vocal cords severed to reduce noise. These procedures were filmed for training purposes, creating an archive of medical atrocity that captured human suffering in explicit detail, footage that was later destroyed by retreating Japanese forces but which survivors and perpetrators described in testimony that confirmed the horror. The vivisections were performed on healthy subjects to establish baseline data, on diseased subjects to observe pathogen effects on organs, on pregnant women to study fetal development and maternal fetal disease transmission, and on children to document pediatric physiological differences. The subjects were kept alive as long as possible to maximize data collection, dying eventually from surgical trauma or blood loss or organ failure. Their bodies then subjected to autopsy to examine tissues that had been damaged by whatever experimental protocol they'd endured. Weapons testing used live human targets to evaluate biological and chemical agent effectiveness under battlefield conditions, experiments that were essentially elaborate murder designed to generate performance data for weapons systems. Subjects were tied to stakes at various distances from explosion points, exposed to anthrax or plague dispersed via bombs or aerosol generators, their infection rates and time to death documented to calibrate weapon delivery systems and estimate casualty rates for operational planning. Flamethrower tests used live prisoners to determine effective range and fuel mixture for maximum lethality, researchers documenting burn patterns and survival times with clinical precision that ignored the screaming human beings being immolated for data points. Grenade tests positioned subjects at different distances to map shrapnel distribution and fragmentation effects. Medical teams waiting to examine the wounded and dying to categorize injury types and assess treatment requirements. These tests transformed the experimental facility into a killing ground where military effectiveness was measured in human lives deliberately sacrificed, where optimizing weapon lethality required knowing exactly how humans died when subjected to various forms of attack. The sexual violence and reproductive experiments represented a particularly horrific category of abuse that targeted women subjects with rape, forced pregnancy, and experimental procedures designed to study sexually transmitted diseases and biological warfare agent effects on reproduction. Women were infected with syphilis and gonorrhea through forced sexual contact with infected prisoners or researchers, their disease progression documented without treatment until they died from complications. Pregnant women were infected with various pathogens to study vertical transmission, the passing of disease from mother to fetus, their pregnancies monitored until birth when both mother and infant would be subjected to vivisection to examine the pathogen's effects on developing organs. Forced sterilization experiments tested various techniques for mass population control, surgical and chemical methods evaluated for efficiency and reversibility, procedures performed without anesthesia because researchers claimed they needed to observe subjects' pain responses. The psychological trauma of these experiments was ignored or deliberately inflicted as researchers studied whether psychological stress affected disease susceptibility or immune response, subjecting prisoners to terror and torture while documenting their physiological reactions. The weapons developed through these experiments were deployed operationally against Chinese civilian populations, transforming Unit 731 from research facility to active participant in genocide. Between 1940 and 1942, Japanese forces conducted at least 12 documented biological warfare attacks against Chinese cities and villages, deploying plague-infected fleas, cholera-contaminated water supplies, and anthrax-laced food, causing epidemics that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and continued spreading disease long after the initial attacks. The Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign in 1942 used biological weapons so extensively that the resulting plague epidemic killed an estimated 400,000 Chinese civilians, more casualties than the atomic bombs would later cause in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. These weren't experimental accidents or isolated incidents but deliberate military operations that applied Unit 731's research to create terror and death among civilian populations, war crimes that violated every principle of international law and human decency but which Japan pursued as legitimate tactics in their imperial conquest. The human cost of Unit 731's operations extended beyond direct victims to include the long-term effects on survivor populations and families, the epidemics that continued spreading after the war ended, and the psychological trauma carried by the small number of subjects who somehow survived. Most subjects were killed before liberation either through experimental protocols or through deliberate execution as Japan prepared to surrender, a systematic murder designed to eliminate witnesses who could testify about what had been done. The few who survived, prisoners who'd escaped during the final chaos or who'd been overlooked in the evacuation, carried physical scars from experimentation and psychological trauma from witnessing horrors that no human should endure. Their testimony, provided to Soviet and later Chinese investigators, documented the basic facts of Unit 731's operations but was dismissed by Western powers as communist propaganda, a convenient excuse that allowed American occupation authorities to avoid investigating claims that would complicate their negotiations with Japanese scientists. The American decision to grant immunity to Unit 731 personnel in exchange for experimental data was made at the highest levels of occupation authority and reflected Cold War strategic calculations that prioritized scientific advantage over justice. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters learned about Unit 731 shortly after Japan's surrender when Soviet forces, which had overrun the Harbin facility, began interrogating captured personnel. The U.S. military realized the Soviets were obtaining valuable biological warfare data and decided they needed access to the same information to maintain strategic parity. Negotiations with Shiro Ishii and other senior Unit 731 scientists produced an agreement, full disclosure of experimental results and biological warfare techniques in exchange for immunity from war crimes prosecution and protection from Soviet demands for extradition. The scientists provided thousands of pages of data documenting their experiments, infection rates, disease progression timelines, autopsy results, weapon effectiveness studies, information that American biological warfare researchers found extremely valuable because it represented human experimentation that U.S. scientists couldn't legally conduct. The ethical compromise was explicit: grant immunity to war criminals who'd tortured thousands of people in exchange for data that would advance American military capabilities, and deny that same data to Soviet competitors. The cover-up required active deception of Allied war crimes tribunals and suppression of evidence that would have supported prosecution. When Soviet prosecutors at the 1946 Khabarovsk war crimes trial charged Japanese biological warfare personnel with crimes against humanity and requested cooperation from American authorities, the U.S. denied having relevant information and refused to extradite personnel who were secretly being interviewed and granted immunity. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which prosecuted Japanese leaders for other atrocities, never charged anyone with Unit 731 related crimes because American prosecutors, who had dominant influence over the tribunal, deliberately excluded biological warfare from the indictment. This wasn't oversight but calculated decision. Prosecuting Unit 731 would reveal that Americans were granting immunity and using the experimental data, would expose the deal that had been made, would create political embarrassment and possibly legal complications for scientists and officials who'd participated in the cover-up. The result was historical injustice, where Nazi doctors were hanged at Nuremberg for experiments less extensive than Unit 731's, while Japanese doctors who'd committed comparable or worse atrocities went free, resumed medical careers in post-war Japan, and in some cases achieved prominent positions in Japanese medical establishment and pharmaceutical industry. Shiro Ishii, the architect of Unit 731, lived until 1959, dying of throat cancer at age 67, never prosecuted, never publicly held accountable, spending his post-war years working as a consultant to American biological warfare programs and later managing a clinic in Tokyo. Several of his subordinates became presidents of medical schools, hospital directors, and pharmaceutical company executives, their Unit 731 experience never officially acknowledged but functioning as informal credential that demonstrated willingness to pursue results regardless of ethical constraints, a characteristic apparently valued by post-war Japanese institutions. The silence about their past was maintained through mutual agreement between Japan and the United States. Japan benefited from not having its medical establishment purged and prosecuted. The U.S. benefited from continued cooperation and access to Japanese biological warfare expertise, and together they constructed a historical narrative that minimized or denied Unit 731's existence and scope. This narrative began fragmenting in the 1980s and 1990s as documents were declassified and survivors came forward, but by then the perpetrators were mostly dead, official apologies were carefully worded to avoid legal liability, and full historical reckoning was complicated by Cold War context that had made the original cover-up seem strategically necessary. The scientific value of Unit 731's data remains contested, with some researchers arguing the experiments produced useful information about disease progression and biological warfare that couldn't have been obtained through ethical means, while others contend the data was scientifically questionable because the extreme conditions of experimentation, subjects who were malnourished, traumatized, and subjected to multiple stressors, made results non-generalizable to normal populations. The ethical debate focuses on whether data obtained through torture and murder should ever be used, even if scientifically valid, whether citing such research legitimizes the crimes that produced it, and whether there's meaningful difference between conducting unethical experiments and benefiting from data those experiments generated. American biological warfare researchers clearly found the data valuable. They incorporated Unit 731's findings into their own programs, used the information to accelerate American biological weapons development, and considered the immunity deal worthwhile despite its moral cost. But whether that data actually provided significant scientific advances or primarily confirmed things that could have been learned through ethical research remains debated, with critics arguing that the supposed strategic value was exaggerated to justify decisions that were morally indefensible regardless of what knowledge they produced. The Japanese government's official position has evolved from complete denial in the immediate post-war period to grudging acknowledgement that Unit 731 existed and conducted questionable activities, while still refusing full accountability or comprehensive disclosure of classified documents that would reveal the program's complete scope. Successive Japanese governments have apologized in general terms for wartime atrocities but have resisted specific apologies for Unit 731, avoided making financial reparations to victims' families, and maintained secrecy around documents that might reveal continuing institutional connections between Unit 731 personnel and post-war medical establishment. This partial acknowledgement satisfies international pressure for some recognition while protecting institutions and individuals from legal liability and historical judgment, a political compromise that frustrates victims' families and historians who want complete truth about what happened and who was responsible. The Chinese government, which has the strongest claim to demand accountability given that most victims were Chinese civilians, has used Unit 731 in political rhetoric when convenient but hasn't pursued comprehensive justice through international courts, perhaps because doing so would require cooperation that Japan and the US have been unwilling to provide and might reveal uncomfortable truths about how much China's own government knew and when. The site of the Harbin facility has been partially preserved as a museum and memorial, though much was destroyed by retreating Japanese forces in August 1945 who burned documents, demolished buildings, and executed remaining prisoners to eliminate evidence. What remains includes some building foundations, preserved artifacts recovered from the site, and extensive exhibits documenting the experiments based on survivor testimony and declassified documents. The museum presents Unit 731 as Japanese militarism's ultimate crime and evidence of the importance of peace and human rights, a framing that's accurate but also serves contemporary political purposes by positioning China as defender of historical memory against Japanese revisionism. Visitors to the site confront physical evidence of industrialized murder, the crematorium where thousands were burned, the dissection rooms where vivisections were performed, the cells where subjects were imprisoned awaiting experimentation. The emotional impact is profound and intentionally so, designed to ensure that Unit 731's crimes are remembered even if complete justice was never achieved, that the victims are honored even if their killers were never punished, that history records what happened even if contemporary politics prevent full accountability. The legacy of Unit 731 extends beyond the specific atrocities committed to broader questions about medical ethics, war crimes prosecution, and the moral compromises nations make when strategic interests conflict with justice. The experiments demonstrated that physicians, trained to heal, could become torturers when authority structures provided permission and when victims were successfully dehumanized through racist ideology that positioned Chinese, Russian, and Korean subjects as inferior and expendable. This transformation didn't require sadistic monsters but merely ordinary doctors who accepted their government's framing of the research as necessary and legitimate, who compartmentalized the humanity of their subjects, who prioritized scientific advancement and military effectiveness over ethical constraints that they were taught didn't apply during wartime emergency. The post-war immunity deal demonstrated that victor nations, despite prosecuting war crimes and establishing international law principles at Nuremberg, would abandon those principles when strategic advantage required it, that justice was negotiable when data or expertise was valuable, that moral clarity about accountability existed only until it conflicted with Cold War competition. These lessons are uncomfortable because they suggest that the ethical progress represented by post-World War II international law was always contingent, always subject to exceptions when power determined that enforcement was inconvenient. The comparison to Nazi medical experiments is inevitable and instructive. Both involved physicians conducting lethal experiments on prisoners deemed subhuman, both were rationalized as necessary military research, both represented profound betrayals of medical ethics, both were eventually exposed and condemned. But the different outcomes are revealing. Nazi doctors were prosecuted at Nuremberg, their experiments universally condemned, their data generally considered too tainted to use even if scientifically valid. Unit 731 doctors were granted immunity, their experiments were covered up for decades, their data was actively used by American researchers who rationalized that wasting the information wouldn't undo the crimes that produced it. This disparity reflects several factors including racism that made Asian victims less sympathetic to Western audiences, strategic calculations that made Japanese cooperation more valuable than German in the emerging Cold War, and timing differences where the full scope of Unit 731 wasn't revealed until decades after Nuremberg had established precedents that were then ignored rather than applied consistently. The result is historical injustice where comparable crimes received incomparable treatment, where some atrocities were prosecuted while others were protected, where justice depended not on universal principles but on strategic considerations that valued some victims more than others. The human stories behind the statistics reveal the individual tragedy of Unit 731 that aggregate numbers obscure. Each of those 10,000 or 300,000 victims was a person with name and family and life that was stolen for experiments that treated them as disposable research materials. They were farmers arrested while working their fields, students taken from universities on fabricated charges, resistance fighters captured and transferred to Unit 731 instead of regular POW camps, civilians kidnapped during military operations and disappeared into the Harbin facility. They experienced terror watching others taken to experimentation and knowing their turn was coming, suffered unimaginable pain during procedures designed to maximize data collection rather than minimize suffering, died alone in cells or on operating tables, were cremated and erased from official record, became anonymous logs in research papers that documented their deaths without acknowledging their humanity. Their families never learned what happened, spent decades or lifetimes wondering whether their missing relatives were alive somewhere, only learning the truth when historical research or official admissions finally revealed Unit 731's existence and confirmed that those who disappeared had been murdered in medical experiments. The whistleblowers and survivors who eventually exposed Unit 731 despite personal risk demonstrated courage that stands in sharp contrast to the institutions that covered up the crimes. Soldiers who'd served at the facility and couldn't live with their guilt came forward in the 1980s and 1990s, providing testimony about what they'd witnessed even though doing so meant admitting their own complicity and facing social ostracism in Japan where discussing wartime atrocities remained taboo. Chinese survivors who'd somehow escaped or survived imprisonment spoke about their experiences despite trauma that made recounting these memories psychologically devastating, providing witness testimony that corroborated documentary evidence and prevented Japan from denying the basic facts. Journalists who investigated despite government resistance and institutional stonewalling, who tracked down former Unit 731 personnel and confronted them with evidence of their crimes, who published findings that generated political controversy and threats, created public awareness that eventually forced partial official acknowledgement. These individuals achieved what institutions wouldn't. They refused to let Unit 731 be forgotten, insisted that history record what happened even if justice couldn't be fully achieved, honored victims by telling their stories even when governments preferred silence. 85 years after Unit 731's creation and 79 years after its closure, the facility's legacy persists in continuing debates about medical ethics, in Chinese-Japanese tensions where historical memory shapes contemporary relations, in American complicity that remains uncomfortable to acknowledge fully, and in the broader pattern of wartime atrocities being treated differently based on strategic considerations rather than universal principles of justice. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 were crimes against humanity that matched or exceeded Nazi atrocities but which received fundamentally different treatment because the perpetrators had valuable knowledge that Cold War competitors wanted to obtain and deny to rivals. The decision to grant immunity in exchange for data was strategic success. America obtained biological warfare information and prevented Soviets from gaining monopoly on that knowledge, but it was moral failure that abandoned justice for expedience, that protected torturers because their expertise was useful, that chose pragmatic advantage over principled accountability. That choice shapes how we understand post-war justice and international law, reveals that the principles established at Nuremberg applied selectively when strategic interests conflicted with prosecution, demonstrates that victor's justice meant different standards for different defeated powers based on calculations about future utility rather than universal moral principles. The victims of Unit 731 deserved better, deserved justice, deserved prosecution of their torturers, deserved acknowledgement from nations that covered up the crimes for strategic purposes. They deserved a world where medical ethics meant something absolute, where doctors couldn't transform into torturers because authority provided permission, where human subjects couldn't be reduced to experimental animals through dehumanizing language and racist ideology. They deserved accountability that would prevent future atrocities by establishing clear consequences for such crimes, rather than immunity deals that taught future perpetrators that strategic value could override moral culpability. They didn't receive any of this, instead becoming forgotten victims of crimes that were hidden for decades and only partially acknowledged when exposure became unavoidable. Their legacy is the museum at Harbin, the historical research documenting what happened, the ethical principles developed in response to revelations about Unit 731 and other World War II experiments, and the uncomfortable truth that justice sometimes loses to strategic expediency, that moral clarity can be abandoned when power determines that enforcement is inconvenient, and that some atrocities remain unpunished not because evidence is lacking but because punishment would conflict with interests that nations value more than accountability. Unit 731 happened because Imperial Japan valued military advancement over human life, continued because institutions prioritized research over ethics, and was covered up because Cold War powers chose strategic advantage over justice. Those choices produced one of history's great atrocities and one of its great injustices, thousands tortured and murdered for military science, their killers protected and freed, their deaths providing data that was used without acknowledgement of its horrific origins, their memory suppressed for decades to protect institutions that had valued secrecy over truth. Remembering Unit 731 requires confronting not just what Japanese doctors did but what American authorities enabled by choosing data over justice, Not just documenting the experiments but acknowledging the cover-up. Not just honoring victims but recognizing that their sacrifice was compounded by the world's decision that prosecuting their torturers was less important than obtaining military advantage from the knowledge those tortures produced.